Thank you all so much for coming today. And I will begin. Ever since October 7th, many important people, including the head of the UN, have argued that there was context to Hamas's massacre. The atrocities committed against innocent men, women, and children didn't happen in a vacuum, they told us. And they were right, only their context was all wrong. I'm here today to speak to you about the true context behind October 7th and everything that has happened since. Oh, the clicker's not working. Okay. Oh, one too many? Okay. So, 2 decades before the State of Israel was born, the British Mandate of Palestine was the scene of one of the worst pogroms ever perpetrated outside of Europe. The massacre of one of the world's most ancient Jewish communities was both more gruesome and more deadly than the infamous Kishinev pogrom, which drove tens of thousands of Jews to flee Eastern Europe. The massacre of Jews in Hebron nearly 1 century ago was a haunting preview of Hamas's massacre. It was on a scale far smaller than October 7th, and yet it transformed the region into the one we know today. The massacre of 1929 was ground zero of what remains a holy war over the Holy Land. Its causes and its aftermath hold all the context we need for the nightmare we are living through today. It was on another Sabbath morning on August 24th, 1929, when 3,000 Muslim men, armed with swords, axes, and daggers, marched through the ancient Jewish quarter of Hebron, the second holiest city in Judaism, burial place of Abraham. That morning, rioters went from house to house, stabbing, torturing, raping, and in some cases castrating and burning their unarmed victims alive. The men who broke into Jewish homes did not distinguish between men, women, children, young, old. Infants were slaughtered in their mothers' arms. Children watched as their parents were butchered by their neighbors. Women and teenage girls were raped before they were killed. Elderly rabbis and yeshiva students were mutilated in ancient synagogues, looted and destroyed. 67 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered, and dozens more were wounded. Many of the victims knew their assailants by name. Until that day, they had been their friends, neighbors, coworkers, and landlords. But amid the horrors were heroes. Out of the nearly 500 Jews who survived that day, half were saved by their Muslim neighbors who risked their own lives to save theirs. Those who survived were evacuated by the British authorities who ruled Palestine at the time. They were told not to return. The British had proved incapable of protecting their Jewish subjects. The massacre in Hebron didn't just decimate one of the world's most ancient Jewish communities. It ended centuries of peaceful coexistence between Jews and Muslims in the city of Abraham, patriarch of both the Jewish and Arab people. Jews had lived in Hebron since the days of Abraham. Their pious lives were centered around the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs, where the forefathers and mothers of the Jewish people are buried. For centuries, Muslims and Jews had lived harmoniously together in Hebron. Before the massacre, Hebron was known as the safest place for Jews in Palestine. This is when that harmony ended, and the reality we know today began. This book wasn't meant to be about October 7th. It was meant to be about a century-old massacre and its aftershocks, which continue to reverberate today. But in the wake of October 7th, those aftershocks tell us everything we need to know about how we got here and what needs to change if the people destined to share this land are ever to know peace. My work on this book began 5 years ago when I was introduced to a family in Memphis, Tennessee, with an epic story to tell of a time and place that has been lost to history. In 2009, Susie Lazarov, a 70-year-old Jewish grandmother, discovered a mysterious box of letters in her attic. Those hundreds of pages of letters were written between 1928 and 1929 by her late uncle, David Shainberg, her father's eldest brother. Susie had never met her Uncle David because he was killed in the Hebron massacre. David Shainberg was 22 years old when he sailed to Palestine in 1928 to study Torah in the land where its stories had unfolded. While studying at the prestigious Hebron Yeshiva, he wrote long poetic letters to his family in Memphis every week. Writing by candlelight, David described Hebron's biblical beauty and serenity and the remarkable relations between the city's Jewish minority and its Arab majority. He wrote of weddings and holidays where rabbis and Muslim leaders danced side by side. He wrote of the Jewish clinic where needy Arabs and Jews alike were treated free of charge. Until she discovered that box in the attic, Susie Lazaroff knew very little about Hebron or the massacre that took her uncle's life. Growing up in Memphis, that tragic day was rarely, if ever, discussed. It was too painful a memory for David's parents, who opposed his move to Palestine. In 1928, young men did not leave their family and move across the world to study Torah. And in 1928, Zionism, the belief in Jewish self-determination in the ancient Jewish homeland, had not yet been embraced by the American Jewish community or the Jews of Palestine. That began to change after the massacre of 1929. Before I read David's letters, I too knew very little about the massacre or the history of Hebron. When I was introduced to David's family in Memphis, I was a freelance journalist based in Tel Aviv, and I had been to Hebron only once. That brief visit in 2011 was so disturbing that I never returned until I started working on this book. In the spring of 2011, I was a student at Columbia Journalism School on a one-day tour of Hebron with Breaking the Silence, an organization founded by Israeli soldiers who had served in Hebron and objected to the injustices they were forced to carry out. They wanted Israelis to know what was being done in the name of security. Nightly raids into randomly chosen Palestinian homes, beatings of those who resisted, stifling restrictions of movement on the streets where they lived, and more. Walking the empty streets of Hebron that day, past barbed wire, Israeli soldiers, and checkpoints, I gazed up at what I thought was an abandoned home and glimpsed a pair of tiny hands gripping the iron bars of a window. I locked eyes with a young Palestinian girl who peered down at me like a caged bird. It struck me that I, a grad student in New York, had more freedom on her street than she did. That day, a city that should be a monument to Judaism's ancient past, became for me a symbol of Israel's moral unraveling. After moving to Tel Aviv in 2013 to work as a freelance journalist, I stayed away from Hebron. And then, in 2019, after reading David's letters, I embarked on a journey to discover how Hebron, the biblical cradle of the Jewish people, had become the deepest wound of this conflict. I wanted to understand why the return of a persecuted people to our native land had led to the misery of another people who feel their homeland has been taken from them. Did it need to be this way? Over the course of 3 years, I spent hundreds of hours with Israelis and Palestinians in Hebron, and I came to understand why this conflict persists and why every peace effort has failed. And no, it did not need to be this way. The massacre in Hebron, its impact, and its echoes today hold the key to understanding the true nature of this conflict and how we can find a way out of it. In 1929, there was no Israeli occupation, no Israeli soldiers, no state of Israel. Jews were a minority in British Mandate Palestine, 20% of a population of less than 1 million people. When the British conquered Palestine from the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, they ended the Ottoman-era restrictions that had limited Jewish immigration for centuries. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 enabled tens of thousands of Jews to flee the pogroms of Europe and build new lives in their homeland, joining the Jewish natives of Palestine, whose families had been there for centuries. The Balfour Declaration promised that in building a Jewish home in Palestine, the rights of the Arab community would be protected. Yet for nearly 1,000 years of Muslim rule in Palestine, Jews had been second-class citizens. Many Arabs opposed the prospect of Jews becoming equal citizens. Chief among them was the British-appointed Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Muslim equivalent of the chief rabbi of Palestine. As the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule, Husseini was the father of the Palestinian nationalist movement. What led to the riots of 1929 was a campaign of propaganda he initiated in order to quiet dissent and criticism from his own people. Husseini had long been accused of corruption, nepotism, and misappropriation of religious funds. Starting in 1928, just as David arrived in Palestine, the Grand Mufti convinced his people that the Jews of Palestine sought to conquer Al-Aqsa Mosque. The third holiest site in Islam, Al-Aqsa sits atop the ruins of the ancient Jewish temples in Jerusalem. That site is known as the Temple Mount, and it is the single holiest site in Judaism. To rally the Arabs of Palestine behind him and to propel his own standing in the wider Muslim world, the Grand Mufti waged a campaign of fear and religious passion, using language that was very similar to the anti-immigrant rhetoric we hear today. Husseini galvanized Islamic sentiment against the country's Jewish minority and against growing Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, where pogroms were raging. In Arabic, the riots of 1929 are known as the Al-Burak Rebellion. Al-Burak is the Arabic name for the Western Wall. According to the Mufti, the Jews who were demanding British protection to pray in peace at the Western Wall without being attacked by Muslims were actually seeking to destroy Al-Aqsa. The Western Wall, the Mufti insisted, was simply the Jews' first step in conquering Al-Aqsa to rebuild their ancient temple. Between 1928 and 1929, Husseini worked to limit Jewish access to the Western Wall. On the eve of Tisha B'Av, in August of 1929, 10,000 Jews gathered at the Western Wall to pray on the most mournful day on the Jewish calendar. The next day, hundreds marched to the wall to protest against the British failure to protect Jewish worshippers from increasing attacks by Muslims at the wall. Their march was peaceful, but Arab leaders and the Arabic press claimed otherwise. Rumors quickly spread that Jews had raped Muslim women and cursed the Prophet Muhammad. In fact, none of that was true. Yet the truth had become irrelevant. In sermons at Al-Aqsa on August 23, 1929, Islamic clerics called on the faithful to defend Islam with their blood. Armed worshippers flowed from the mosque and down to the Old City, where they attacked Jewish passers-by and set fire to Jewish businesses. The riots quickly engulfed Palestine, killing 133 Jews and wounding 400 more. The Jewish communities of Hebron, Gaza, and other locations throughout the country were evacuated by British forces. Yet the Jews of Hebron, the haven of coexistence, paid the heaviest price, suffering more brutality and more casualties than any other community in Palestine. Refusing to believe the warnings ahead of time, Jewish leaders in Hebron had rejected offers of protection from the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense force that would later become the IDF. When members of the Haganah visited Hebron days before the riots erupted, they were told to leave. Our Arab neighbors are our friends, the Jewish leaders of Hebron insisted. They did not believe or want to believe that their friends and neighbors would turn on them. After all, the Jews of Hebron in 1929 were not Zionists building a Jewish home and building the foundations of a Jewish state. They were pious Jews living a quiet existence centered around the Torah. That the massacre did happen there was a turning point for both Zionism and the conflict itself. In 1929, Zionism was not a mainstream Jewish value. Many traditional Jews, including David Schoenberg himself, disdained the Young Movement as a secular contamination of Judaism. The return of the Jewish masses to Zion, they believed, could only be realized through God's will and the arrival of the Messiah. Many secular American Jews also rejected Zionism, fearing it could threaten their fragile place in American society. All of that antagonism against Zionism was challenged by the Hebron massacre, which epitomized the tragedy of the stateless, powerless Jew. Thousands of Jews had returned to their ancient homeland to escape the pogroms of Russia, Ukraine, and Poland. The pogrom that followed them to the city of their forefathers was both devastating and galvanizing. For centuries, Jews had been treated as unwanted strangers precisely because they lived in exile. European anti-Semites often told Jews, "Go back to Palestine." Now they had come home, only to be told they didn't belong here either. The failure of British forces to protect the Jews of Palestine in 1929 led them to unite around Zionism. After the massacre, many who had until then opposed Zionism now agreed that Jews could only be safe in their own country under the protection of their own army. After the massacre, the British brought a commission to Palestine to determine the causes of the riots. In 1930, that commission pardoned the Mufti. Instead, it blamed the riots on the peaceful Jewish demonstration at the Western Wall on Tisha B'Av. The British concluded that Muslim fears of Jewish immigration were legitimate. And so 1 year after the massacre, the British issued a new policy, vastly limiting Jewish immigration and land purchases in Palestine. When the Mufti led a violent rebellion in 1936, the British responded by abandoning the Balfour Declaration altogether and its promise of a Jewish home. The pressure of terrorism had worked. And against the backdrop of Nazi persecution, the Jews of Eastern Europe were largely banned from immigrating to their ancient homeland. During and after the Holocaust, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees who arrived on Palestine's shores were sent to British internment camps, both in Palestine and in Cyprus. After his rebellion killed a British official, the British finally decided to arrest the Grand Mufti. Yet he fled the country and allied himself and his cause with Adolf Hitler. Throughout World War II, the Grand Mufti was lavishly paid by the Nazi regime as its leading voice in the Arab world. Living in a Nazi-financed estate in Berlin, the first leader of the Palestinian people led the Arab branch of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. He issued Arabic radio broadcasts of Nazi propaganda throughout the Arab world and recruited tens of thousands of Muslim fighters for the Nazis. He toured concentration camps and befriended the architects of the final solution. Hitler himself considered Husseini an honorary Aryan. When the war ended, the Grand Mufti was placed on the UN's list of Nazi war criminals. Yet once again, he fled. First to France and then to Cairo, and eventually he settled in Beirut, where he led his people's jihad against the Jews of Palestine. His apprentice in that jihad was his young cousin, Yasser Arafat. The Grand Mufti was the first of many corrupt Palestinian leaders to realize the power of Al-Aqsa and disinformation. He set the formula for every Palestinian leader since. Hamas has perpetuated the same lies about Al-Aqsa and Israeli plans to destroy it. Hamas and other Palestinian groups have used that lie and others to galvanize support and distract their people from their own inability to lead them out of perpetual poverty. There is a direct line between 1929 and 2023. The parallels between then and now, are a testament to how little has changed over the course of a century of this holy war. The forces that drove Arabs in Hebron to rape, torture, and murder their Jewish neighbors 1 century ago were nearly identical to the forces behind October 7th. It's no coincidence that Hamas named its attack on October 7th the Al-Aqsa Flood. Hamas is the direct heir of Haj Amin al-Husseini, and like the Grand Mufti, Hamas presents itself as the defender of Al-Aqsa and Islam against the Jews. Much like the rioters of 1929 praised God as they slaughtered innocent men, women, and children, so too did Hamas fighters in footage they themselves posted on social media on October 7th. Just as the Jews who were killed in Hebron in 1929 were not Zionists, the Jews killed in southern Israel on October 7th were not settlers. In fact, many of them were left-wing Israelis who had spent the previous 9 months protesting against Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing government. Many of those killed and kidnapped were peace activists who had spent years, if not their entire lives, trying to help Palestinians. The euphoric celebrations in the West Bank and Gaza on October 7th, and the scenes of Palestinians crowding around Israeli hostages in Gaza and cheering Hamas's attack will not be easily forgotten in Israel. the perpetrators of the massacre of 1929, were also hailed as heroes. According to Palestinian polls, the majority in the West Bank and Gaza supported the attacks of October 7th. Yet they also denied that Hamas killed children, raped women, or murdered any innocent civilians. In the aftermath of October 7th, many around the world blamed Israel for the massacre. The atrocities of 1929 were also denied by Arab leaders and blamed on their Jewish victims. The difference was that in 1929, the international community saw through those denials. In newspapers like the New York Times, those lies were presented as lies. Newspapers did not attempt to justify the massacre. On August 26, 1929, 35,000 people marched through Manhattan, protesting against the riots and against the British failure to protect the Jews of Palestine. Meanwhile, in cities across America on October 8, 2023, protesters marched in support of the massacre. The line between 1929 and 2023 cuts through a century of Muslim leaders' refusal to share this tiny sliver of land with the Jewish people. The Grand Mufti rejected the first two-state solution in 1937, and he did so again in 1947 when the UN voted to partition Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state. Palestine would have gained independence for the first time in its history. After all, the British had conquered Palestine from the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the territory for more than 400 years. Before that, Palestine was the province of a rotating cast of foreign powers, including the Greeks and the Crusaders. It was under Roman rule in the 1st century that the land of Israel was renamed Palestina, the Roman name for the Israelites' biblical enemies, the Philistines. The Romans did this to punish the Jews of Judea who had waged a rebellion against their Roman conquerors. While the Jewish leaders of Palestine embraced the UN partition plan in 1947, the Mufti and other Arab leaders vehemently rejected it. The Mufti declared jihad and established the Army of the Holy War. The day the British left Palestine in 1948, the armies of Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon invaded the newly born Jewish state. The war against Israel ended with Israel's shocking victory, what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. Yet imagine what would have been if the Mufti and other Arab leaders had agreed to 2 states for 2 people in 1947. The Mufti's political descendants have rejected every 2-state solution since. When Israel's offer of a Palestinian state in 2000 was rejected by Yasser Arafat and followed by 5 years of suicide bombings, many Israelis came to the conclusion that Palestinian leaders were not really interested in peace. And while the commitment to armed struggle has enriched corrupt Palestinian leaders beyond their wildest dreams, it has made life for the Palestinian people ever more hopeless and the prospects for peace ever more distant. October 7th has now convinced even left-wing Israelis and peace activists who oppose Netanyahu that there really is no partner for peace. The massacre of 1929 and its haunting echoes today are key to understanding the world's most intractable conflict and any hope of resolving it. The failure to heed these lessons will keep us in this devastating, never-ending cycle of war. I began writing Ghosts of a Holy War 4 years before October 7th. I never even once fathomed that anything even remotely similar to what happened in Hebron would happen again. The fact that it did, and that it is being justified, shows that the actual history of this conflict has been ignored for far too long. My hope in writing this book is that it will no longer be ignored. Thank you.
Wow. So this is actually my Yom Kippur reading, and Rosh Hashanah reading, and maybe again next year. It's a really, really important book. Yardena, you And I should remind everybody about Dan's fabulous rule, the first rule of asking a question, that it has to be a question. You mentioned it a number of times in your fabulous presentation, but I want to probe a little more deeply. This book, when you had started a number of years ago, was going to be 1929. It was going to utilize these papers, these correspondence from Memphis, Tennessee, and look at the trying situation of a family, of a young man who perishes in the Hebron massacre in 1929. And at some point, obviously after October 7th, 2023, you decided that you had to bring it up to date. That there was a story, a reception history of Hebron and its values, its image, and its politic. Can you walk us through that moment, whether it was with your family, with your editor, with yourself, where you felt compelled to write a book that didn't stop in the 1920s and 1930s?
Yeah, so like many of you probably, I was pretty incapacitated after October 7th. I was still writing my book, and I found myself just incapable of writing. For a good month, I would try to keep writing the book as I had been writing it, and the words weren't flowing. It didn't feel like it made sense anymore to tell the story as I intended to tell it. I had planned to take it well past 1929 through today, but my focus before October 7th was going to be how Hebron really had become, had gone from being this beacon of coexistence to becoming the antithesis of coexistence, and what that journey told us about the last century, and again, about how we could find a way out of it. But that just didn't make sense anymore, zeroing in on Hebron. It really became such a bigger story. And it was through taking a step back and going back to reporting. I had taken a break from my journalism as I had been doing it before the book. I'd taken a long break to write the book, and I decided, okay, I'm just going to report on this hostage crisis, because I was actually living in the States at that point. My family and we had just moved back to the States in July of 2023. So we had just settled into this new life in New York after leaving our life in Israel. And I was just reporting on the hostage crisis, interviewing hostage families, Israeli officials. And it was through that reporting that I realized, that there is a direct connection between the massacre of 1929 and this massacre and everything we are going through now. And I ended up using a lot of that reporting to write new chapters of the book. I had to throw away entire chapters I had already written. And it was with the help of my editor and also my husband, who's here today. We all kind of talked about how it could be written through this new prism, and I ended up somehow sticking to my original deadline. But the publication of the book changed. It was originally going to be published in 2025, but because of the timeliness of it, was pushed up to October 1st.
Yes. Does everybody hear the question? What sparked the Hebron massacre?
So I spoke about this a bit in my presentation, but I can go into more detail. So in the year that preceded the massacre, the Grand Mufti began spreading this rumor that the Jews of Palestine were planning to conquer Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that propaganda really took hold. And on top of the propaganda he was spreading, he also began to limit Jewish access to the Western Wall, whether by encouraging Muslims to go to the Western Wall, and they were attacking Jewish worshipers there. He also initiated a building project where he built a door into the Western Wall that led Muslim worshipers directly to Al-Aqsa, which made no sense to do because Muslims did not worship at the Western Wall. But what it did do was help Muslims get to the Western Wall, where they increasingly attacked Jewish worshipers, which was why on Tisha B'Av there was that march of young Jews protesting against the British failure to protect Jews at the Western Wall, and to just protect Jewish access to the Western Wall, because it was increasingly difficult for Jews to get to the Western Wall. And the British had really just completely ignored those complaints. And that march, which was peaceful, was portrayed as violent. And it was this disinformation that led to the riots, which erupted a couple weeks after Tisha B'Av. And on top of the disinformation about Al-Aqsa, there was also wild disinformation that was spread about the riots themselves. So when they erupted on August 23rd, 1929 in Jerusalem, they began with Arab attacks on Jews. But rumors quickly spread outside of Jerusalem that it was Jews who had attacked Arabs. And in Hebron itself, that was much of why people were trying to avenge the blood of Arabs allegedly spilt in Jerusalem, and also defending Islam and Al-Aqsa from this Jewish plot to destroy Al-Aqsa.
So this is a very, very hard book to write. Beyond the erudition and the archival research is also the decision of how much access to provide your reader into the tragedy, into the violence. It's something that I think you were very judicious about, but also felt a responsibility both for 1929 and 2023 to report on that. To maybe these chapters, I felt like I was witnessing and I was paying witness to it. Can you talk about your decision and the process of writing some really challenging stuff?
Yeah, so when I read David's letters, he obviously doesn't speak about the massacre because he was killed in the massacre, but reading his letters led me to embark on the research to understand what had happened to him and so many others in Hebron. And I was shocked at the lack of literature in English about the massacre. I think that's why so few people know about the massacre. I knew very little about it before I began working on this book. Yet the literature exists in archives. There are mountains of evidence of what happened, whether it's through testimony of the survivors that was taken just days after the massacre, newspaper articles, not just in the Jewish press. I mean, the New York Times reported extensively on what happened in 1929. For a whole week, it was front page news. And I spent a good 2 years researching what happened in 1929, reading everything I could, and I realized that because there's so little written in English about it, or at least books, since people aren't going to go sorting through archives and old newspapers to find out what happened, I felt a responsibility to describe what happened in detail, so that no one could deny it happened, so that people could understand what happened. And I took that same approach to October 7th. And there was someone who said, people know what happened on October 7th. You don't really need to go into too much detail. But there are many people, our cleaning lady who is American and, reads the news, she had no idea what happened on October 7th until this week. My husband actually told her about it. And there are plenty of people who don't know or think that it wasn't, such a big deal. And so I really feel like there was this responsibility to describe in detail what happened during both massacres, and also it shows the parallels between them, which are really chilling.
Yes.
Could you describe what Hebron is like today? I know you mentioned in 2011 when you were there that you were concerned about the environment. What has transformed over this period of time, and in light of what's happened last year in October?
Yeah, so what I described in seeing in 2011, the checkpoints all over Hebron, the soldiers standing on almost every corner, the iron bars that are on most Palestinian homes in Hebron, that's still the case in Hebron, but as you can imagine, since October 7th, the restrictions on Palestinian freedom of movement in Hebron have gotten even worse. So there are still curfews in some areas that are kind of lifted and then brought back. So it's life for Palestinians in Hebron has gotten worse since October 7th, and it's just really a depressing reality. I think when I was in the Tomb of the Patriarchs, every time I would feel, this deep spirituality within the walls of the Tomb of the Patriarchs, but then the second I would go out, it would just be like this really depressing kind of juxtaposition of, spirituality and holiness against, the realities of war. I mean, it's essentially a war zone, and Hebron did feel like that even before October 7th. My first time visiting in 2019, having not been there since that one time in 2011, the morning I arrived, there had been a stabbing attack against soldiers at the Tomb of the Patriarchs. And that was kind of a recurring theme. Every time I went to Hebron, there was a terror attack, either in Hebron that day or somewhere else. One of my later trips, I was coming from Beersheba, and there had been like this ISIS-inspired really horrific attack in Beersheba that day. And, there were so many times where I felt, I still had to do this reporting in Hebron, but I was pregnant the first time I went back to Hebron. I was pregnant with my first child. I was pregnant with my second when I was still working on this book. And it often felt, sometimes I felt, is it responsible for me to be going here and doing these interviews? But again, I just felt like I had to tell this story.
Yes.
Wow. All right, good. A lot of questions. I'll start with a question, but I want to have a follow-up. So the question is, when you went to Hebron with Breaking the Silence, did they tell you about the Hebron massacre in 1929? The answer is no. Okay. My follow-up is this. So my first time I ever took a course in the Arab-Israeli conflict, which was what we called it in the 80s, it wasn't mentioned. And then I've read the syllabus for the University of Pennsylvania, where I'm a professor. It's not mentioned in the syllabus. I haven't taken the class, but I don't think it's mentioned. And I know that most people don't know about it. I mean, it's not something that I've learned about it. If you are on the right social media feed on October 8th, it was filled, your media feed, letters from people recounting the massacre. So my question is, this follow-up question is, why didn't they teach you that in Breaking the Silence, and why is it not in the universities? And what is now that you've really deeply explored this, what is your explanation for why it's been disappeared?
So not only was it not mentioned on my tour of Hebron in 2011 with Breaking the Silence, but my undergrad degree was in international relations with a focus on foreign policy in the Middle East. And in all of my courses on the history of this conflict, or, Palestinian history, Israeli history, it was never mentioned, or if it was such a fleeting reference that I didn't remember. It wasn't important enough in the context of those lessons that it really stuck with me. And also in my years of reporting from Israel and the West Bank, I had never really come across it. And I think that it's for the same reason why so few people have heard about the Grand Mufti and his history of Nazi, not just affiliation. I mean, he was essentially a Nazi. He was placed on the list of Nazi war criminals, and yet we don't hear about that. So I haven't done any studies on why the massacre isn't really mentioned in these history books, why the Mufti's Nazi work with the Nazis isn't really known. I think it's because it's an inconvenient truth for so many, and I think it's much easier to paint this conflict as one that began in 1948, as so many people like to do, especially since October 7th, where there is 2 decades at least of conflict before 1948. And I think that's why also when people talk about 1948, they leave out the reason 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled. I mean, it wasn't just one day Israel was born and these people were forced out. It was a war declared against the Jewish state by Arab leaders, and yet that is often left out of not just talking points by people on one side or the other, but even in, newspaper articles, in the New York Times and other respected or formerly respected news organizations, that context is so often omitted because it makes this conflict, as complicated as it is, and it's not as simplistic as people would like it to be. So I'm sure there are other explanations for why, but that's my idea.
First of all, I'm so proud of you. I'm so emotional. Your parents and your husband must be so proud of you.
Thank you.
Really, I'm the proud mother of 2 lone soldiers who were in the terror tunnels in 2014 when they were makeshift, and one that is a first responder on October 7th who lives in Netivot with his family, and the atrocities that he saw were unbearable, that no child should have to see. Having said that, kind of parlaying off of what this gentleman asked, it's a 2-part question. First of all, my son went to the one that's a first responder he's in Lebanon now, but on October 7th was in Netivot, went to the University of California, Irvine, where he took a class and wrote on exactly what the massacre, and he was flunked by the professor who is Jewish. Flunked. He signed himself out and went and joined the IDF.
Wow.
So my question is, I'm going to try not to be clumsy about it. The disdain that you spoke about of toward budding Zionism back in 1929, they were afraid of their social status, you had said. What impact do you believe that mentality has on, without sounding rude, but the Jews who are either in denial, as you're saying, it's an inconvenient truth? Here we have the juxtaposition that you're speaking about. We have the Zionists, like my children, who made Aliyah and are there and are literally putting their lives on the line so that this doesn't happen again, juxtaposed against and I don't mean to be shaming at all, I promise, but I know it sounds shaming. The Jewish people that think that's happening over there has no impact on us today. In your research, are you seeing the danger of that mentality? And can you speak to that a little bit and what you've seen through your research?
Yeah, I think it's very similar. The anti-Zionism we see today in the U.S., and not just in the U.S., but around the world, among Jews. The Jewish anti-Zionism we see, I think, is very similar to then it wasn't even anti-Zionism, it was just kind of like, it wasn't embraced. And then it was also because it threatened the fragile place of American Jews in American society when American Jews were still very new to the U.S. in many cases, and in some cases they had been there for centuries, but in many cases they were, Jewish immigrants. And sorry, that's my son. Probably hears me and wants to come to me. Yeah, and I really don't know what it would take to wake Jewish anti-Zionists up today to the reality that, at the end of the day, we're all Jews. Whether you're Zionist or anti-Zionist, it doesn't matter to our enemies. Just like on October 7th, Hamas didn't, go into these kibbutzim and say, oh no, these people are the ones who bring sick Palestinians Israel for medical treatment, let's not kill them. There was no distinguishing. And I think that a lot of Jewish anti-Zionists don't understand that, this is all, I think, hatred of Jewish people and rejection of the right to Jewish self-determination. And I think that there's a lot of confusion about what Judaism is among Jewish people. I think that there's this idea that Judaism can somehow be separated from Israel, when I think Israel is the bedrock of the Jewish faith. I mean, every religion is about Israel. So I don't know what it will take to wake people up, but I do know that after 1929, that the embrace of Zionism that followed the massacre of 1929 wasn't so much among Jews in America. It was about the Jews in Palestine who suddenly understood, okay, our lives are in danger and the British aren't going to protect us, no other foreign power is going to protect us, only we can protect ourselves. Among American Jews, as many of you may know, it took the Holocaust for that mass, transformation and mass embrace of Zionism to happen within the American Jewish community. I obviously hope that it won't take, something like that to wake people up to that, but I do think it's going to, it's not going to happen from, October 7th. I think many of us probably hoped that, people would understand what Israel and the Jewish people are up against. After October 7th, unfortunately, anti-Semitism only increased, 400-fold. But it is definitely a very similar theme to what we saw back then.
Yeah, there we go. I want to just take 2 questions from the internet real quick so we can include that audience as well. I'll start with I think a simple one. What language or languages were people speaking in Hebron in 1929? I think they're trying to ask, could everybody understand each other?
That's such an interesting question. I'm so glad someone asked that. Thank you. So it was a mix. Among the Sephardic Jews of Hebron, Mizrahi Jews of Hebron, they were speaking a mix of Arabic and Ladino, and also Hebrew. And the Ashkenazi Jews of Hebron, they were either speaking Hebrew or a mix of Hebrew and Yiddish. There were American Jews in Hebron, like David, who had come to learn at the Hebron Yeshiva. David actually spent time learning Hebrew as well, so he was, obviously speaking English. But even some of the Ashkenazi Jews, who had, at least those who had been there for many generations, they also spoke Arabic. One of the most interesting letters David wrote was the first one he wrote upon arriving in Hebron, which was just, culture shock. Like, he grew up in Memphis, not a huge Jewish community, but out of the Jewish community, there were no Sephardic Jews, no Mizrahi Jews, and he said he often couldn't tell who was Jewish and who was Arab because the Arabic Jews, he called them, they spoke Arabic, they dressed in these long regal Arabic robes, and he said the women, some of the Sephardic women and the Arab women, he said they looked like ghosts. He thought that they were wearing sheets because he had never seen women wearing burqas before. But that was really interesting to learn that the camaraderie among Jews and Arabs in Hebron was such that they weren't just, living side by side in peace the way some, coexistence in certain cities in Israel is today, where, in Jaffa or in Haifa, you see some of that, but in Hebron it was very real. Like, they owned businesses together. They drank coffee together in one another's homes. There were Shabbos Goyim among the Arabs in Hebron. So it was really just incredible, the level of harmony that existed in Hebron before the massacre.
One more just from online, then we'll go back to the in-person audience. From Zoom, this was, it's getting on how you hope will tell the story of October 7th in 95 or 100 years. What decisions did you make telling the story of the Hebron massacre would you recommend to future historians talking about October 7th in 90 or 100 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I found it really important, as I said before, not just to document in detail what happened, but also using people's names. You know, it wasn't just, in this house, this. Like, I go into detail about who these people were, their families were, their history in Hebron, what had brought them there, what their lives were like before the massacre. But also I found it very important to go into detail about the heroism of the Arabs who saved their Jewish neighbors. I mean, there were 3,000 Muslim men who participated in the massacre, but there were 24 Jewish Arab families who rescued their Jewish neighbors and risked their lives to do so. One of the men literally arrived on a white horse to save the Jewish family that was renting their home from him. And he was over 70 years old, but he stood in front of their door before a mob of armed Arab men and said, you won't enter this home. If you do, it'll be over my dead body. And they went on to stab him, but he didn't back down. He stayed there. And even after they left, without entering the home, he stayed there for hours to prevent them from coming back. And the family inside, he referred to them as my family. And there were many of these heroic stories on October 7th as well, of Arab Israelis, Arab citizens of Israel, who risked their own lives to save Jewish Israelis from the massacre by Hamas. And I go into detail of that heroism as well. So I hope that in future, those stories will also be remembered, not just the horrors.
So thank you for coming. And thank you for this book. In my discussions with people who take an opposite narrative, sounds more like a vicious argument, right? The few that actually know about this date will use the fact that there was a Grand Mufti as evidence for having an existing pre-Palestinian state before the Jews were there. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, I don't even really understand the thinking behind that. So they argue that the fact that there was a Grand Mufti proves what exactly? I don't understand.
There was a Palestinian government establishment before the Jews had theirs.
Okay. So I would say there's this denial on both sides. I think, we see this on both sides, Palestinian supporters or Palestinians themselves who argue there was no history, Jewish history in Israel before the creation of the modern state of Israel. I encountered that in Hebron from the Arab mayor of Hebron, who said that the archaeological findings in Israel are all Zionist propaganda, that Abraham was not Jewish, he was Muslim. There's this kind of wild denial on that side, and also there's also the denial that there was ever a Palestinian state on the Jewish side. There are Jews and Israelis who say, there was never a Palestinian state, when there was. There was a state of Palestine, or a province of Palestine. Jews and Arabs alike were all referred to as Palestinians. But there was never an independent state of Palestine. Palestine was always governed by outside powers, and so, the Grand Mufti was appointed by the British, and he wasn't really like a government official. He was a religious official, kind of like a chief rabbi of Palestine, which there was as well. I don't think denying either side's history in this land helps anyone. The Palestinians have history in this land just as the Jews who either lived there or were returning after centuries of not being there have a history. And I think, I don't think that helps anyone.
Rav Kook, Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Kook, was chief rabbi of Palestine, dies in 1935, before there's a state of Israel. We have a few more questions. Yes?
Thank you. A most wonderful presentation. Obviously, the subject is incredible in the book, I'm sure. I wanted to ask you, how much can you give us an explanation as to whether or not there was a sort of an Arab Spring in 1929.
Arab Spring, you said?
Yes, sort of. How much did it go from Hebron onto the Arab countries? I know that it did. It expanded itself in some way. And I will tell you on a personal level that in 1929, a week after this massacre, my great-grandfather was murdered in an Arab country by a mob that was screaming against Israel. And on a side note, the Mufti was appointed by the Turks. Thank you. So it was irreligious. The Mufti was not a national, was a religious appointment. So was the rabbi over the Jews.
Right. So the Grand Mufti, yeah, so I discussed this at length in my book. So his father had been the Grand Mufti before him, and his half-brother had also been the Grand Mufti before him. They were appointed by the Turkish, but then after the British took over Palestine, they appointed him. But so in 1929, there still wasn't this Palestinian identity of Palestinians as we know it today. I mean, as I said, Jews and Arabs living in Palestine were all Palestinian. And it was in the rebellion in 1936 that I mentioned briefly in my presentation, that was when Palestinian, like Arab nationalism in Palestine had really taken hold, and the Arab masses rebelled against the British, as well as the Zionists, but it was more of a rebellion against the British. And it's still, I wouldn't really call it an Arab Spring, but there were also, uprisings by Arabs in Syria against the French and in Lebanon, but it didn't really, I don't think it was inspired by Arabs in Palestine, because those uprisings in some cases happened before the rebellion of 1936. If you're looking for a book about that rebellion, there's a really good one by Orrin Kessler, Palestine 1936. But I also discuss that rebellion in my book at length.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Great presentation, and thank you for your wisdom. I have two quick questions. What was the incident that triggered the conflict in 1929 versus other tragedies in 1883, in the Dung Gate, in the Jewish Yemenite who settled outside of Dung Gate, in Jaffa as well? And my other quick question is your book will be available in audiobooks?
Great question, thank you. Yeah, a lot of people have been asking me that. It will be available on audiobook. It's not yet, but it will be available in audiobook in December. And right now it's on, Kindle and hardcover. So I think I spoke about this pretty, at length about what triggered the massacre of 1929 specifically, but I will speak about, to your point of having, before 1929, there were other, I wouldn't say eruptions of violence, because nothing really achieved that level of, rising to the point of being a mass casualty event. Until 1929, there really hadn't been, a mass casualty event as a result of this conflict. It was the first one. Before then, there had been, some riots. There was a riot in 1920 and 1921 that claimed, in one case it was 40 lives. So it's nothing, to dismiss as inconsequential, but it didn't really amount to the beginning of this conflict. I think the forces that we see today that drive this conflict really began in 1929 with, the disinformation about Al-Aqsa, the use of propaganda and disinformation to whip up violence, and it was actually after one of these riots, the riot in 1920, that the British had already wanted to arrest the Grand Mufti before he became the Grand Mufti. He was involved in inciting a riot in 1920, and when they appointed him Grand Mufti, it was after pardoning him for that incitement. So the idea that this was a mistake to appoint the Grand Mufti to the all-powerful post that he held, to call that a mistake is, the biggest understatement. I mean, the man who made that decision to appoint him was actually a Zionist himself. He was Jewish. He was the first High Commissioner of Palestine, Herbert Samuel. And that's considered the greatest blunder of his entire career, which was a really otherwise illustrious, wonderful career. But that decision left such an impact on this land and its people. I mean, they were the people who he was running against for the post of Grand Mufti were not anti-Semitic. They were much more moderate, and they should have won. I mean, he came in last in the election, and because of some loopholes, Herbert Samuel ended up being able to appoint him with the hope of appeasing the anti-Zionist element of the Arab population and the anti-British element of the Arab population, which wasn't very strong at that point. But also because his family had this history of holding the post of Grand Mufti, it was seen as, the smart thing to do, to choose him despite him having lost the election.
All right, final question.
I've been reading and hearing that Jewish and Israeli writers have been banned from certain, their book tours. So since you're just starting, I was just wondering, was there any place that you were supposed to go that have said, you're Jewish, you're writing history, we don't want to hear from you?
So I would say luckily that hasn't happened to me, but given what great press some people have gotten because they were banned for being Jewish, I kind of was hoping that would happen to me. But no, I have not been banned. Although, I mean, you never know what venues might have just not invited me because the nature of this book or the argument it makes. But I have not had any events canceled yet.
All right,
Yeah.
be in good company with Mark Twain. Wow. There are some book talks in which the author has given away every single chapter. I promise you that is not the case. Herbert Samuel appeared at the very end, but Baruch Goldstein, Yitzhak Rabin, Bill Clinton, Ehud Barak, Moshe Dayan, Golda Meir, all appear. And there's much, much more to understand about. I think when you talked about Hebron being the crucible, the biblical crucible of the Jewish people. But in many ways, it is the crucible for 21st century attempts and visions of peace and maybe something opposite. Yardena, on behalf of everybody here, thank you so, so much.
Thank you so much.